to Melanated View, where the thoughts, the experiences, and the opinions of 5 Black Canadians are shared with you in mind. The goal? To challenge the norms in a really safe environment. And as you can see, we're in the middle of a pandemic, and we are 6 feet apart, and we have our masks, and we just wanted to make sure that you felt safe with us coming into your living rooms. Today's topic is all about health. And we're going to talk about health within our community. And I know, Ali, you had an amazing story to talk about.
And thank you for that. So, such an important topic. We know we're in the middle of a pandemic, and it's huge. And when we were kind of getting together, and some of the premise of what brought the group together is just through the intersections of our experiences. And one of the experiences that really resonated to me around this topic is I noticed that there was just some speech issues lately. And a lot of times you chalk it up to COVID, you chalk it up to stress, but I noticed that it was impacting me. And, in our culture, it's, going to the doctor or going to your aunties or whatever and saying, I have this, they're like, oh, don't worry about it, it's fine. So that's very much my mentality. So I thought, you know what, no, my speech just isn't right, I'm not as articulate, and it's bothering me. So I went to the doctor. And it was so odd because as a minority, as a Black woman, you try every day to not go into situations where you're like, this is happening because I'm Black. You really try to live life with, an open mind and really be mindful of your experiences and to not put your, self-perceived consumptions on other people. So I went to the doctor, and just through early discussion and conversation, the first diagnosis was bipolar. And I'm saying my speech. And she's like, but it could be bipolar. Do you know what bipolar is? And I was like, yeah, Kanye. And she's like, no, there's another bipolar. And I was like, well, I haven't Googled it yet, so I will match you and get to kind of where you're at with your clinical diagnosis, because I am a Google doctor. But where are we going with bipolar? So I was really trying to understand. And she kept going back to, well, culturally, you have a higher likelihood to have bipolar or be affected by bipolar disorder. And I was like, but I'm talking about my speech. So it's wild. So at that moment, I knew, and I've been at this intersection many times in my life, but I knew that I had to advocate. I'm not dismissing her professional experience, but I knew that there was a point where I had to pause, hear what she had to say, and take it away. So I did. We went through more testing. Everything was coming back clean. Everything was coming back good. And then we went to a doctor. She referred me to a psychiatrist. And by the love of God, this man was Black. And the first thing, we sat down and had a conversation, and the typical, how are you feeling? Are you sad? Just questions. And immediately he's like, I don't agree with what your doctor was, kind of noting here as something for me to be mindful of. And I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, you are highly ambitious. You have a speech, what are, how has your diet changed? And we went through another string of questions, and it was something completely unrelated. But the thing that really resonates is, what if I didn't have means, or I didn't have access, or I took the first recommendation that came across my plate, and I was on medication today, taking medication for something that wasn't even true or right. You know what I mean? Has that ever?
I do.
It's
well,
crazy.
I had a situation years ago where I had sort of a mole on my nose, and it felt to me as though it had been there forever. My mother then told me, no, somehow it had arrived. So I was at the doctor, and I mentioned it to her because my mom had said, I think it's growing a little bit. So she sent me to a dermatologist to have it checked out. And, my mom was all over, you better ask if it can be cancer, all this stuff. So I mentioned that, and the dermatologist looks at me and says, oh no, your melanin is too dark. People like you don't get skin cancer.
Oh.
And I said, really?
That's news.
And so, yeah, that was it. So then she sent me on my way. And then a couple of years later, my doctor sent me back because she was leaving her practice and wanted to have everything checked again. And sure enough, it had grown. And so the dermatologist said, well, we can cut it off because if it's grown, it's not considered cosmetic surgery, right? So she cut it off, and she said not to worry. Ended up, it was basal cell carcinoma. I ended up going to so I've had a nose job, right? And they had to cut it out completely to make sure everything was gone. And when I was seeing the other doctor who was doing that, the surgeon, he said that it is so sad how many people he has to take care of with skin cancer at the later stages with darker skin because somebody has told them that they can't have skin cancer.
That is insane, the fact that you have to advocate for your care. is it not a fair assumption that I, human, go to doctor, your profession, and receive treatment first time right? Is that crazy? Like, I don't know, what are you guys thinking?
Can I flip the script for a second?
Flip that script.
When you talk about like your stories of being self-advocates, I think of a story where my doctor actually advocated for me. And I've had the same family doctor my whole life, and I went in just off of a routine issue with my leg where I thought that I just had a muscle spasm, and it was something that I needed to either ice or I needed to put hot compress on it. Didn't know what it was, so I thought I would check in with her. And she said, you want to know what, just to be safe, why don't you just go into the hospital and just make sure it's not something serious? And lo and behold, I found out that I have a rare but hereditary blood disease that actually results in me having blood clots. And I'm on a blood thinner basically for the rest of my life. And I never would have known this unless my doctor had advocated for me.
That is huge.
I think it's the thing, like I've had both experiences, but regardless of whether it ends happily or and ends with healthcare, like you're going in there, or it ends in disappointment, I never step foot into any healthcare practitioner's office or building knowing or believing that I'm going to get the best of care. I've been let down so many times by the healthcare system, and even one of my earliest experiences was going to the doctor for a routine checkup. I was maybe like 11 or 12, and him saying that I was nearly obese when I had just sprouted,
You were 11 or 12. You're like, I
Yeah.
was just trying to live.
And I was already
Yeah.
like 5'7" or 5'8". Like I grew quickly,
Yeah.
and the first thing that I'm hearing is, you better be careful or else you're going to gain more weight.
Wow.
The
Even though I
effect
was
that
just
can have on a
growing
young
as a
kid,
person,
yeah.
And it's just like experiences have been colored over and over time, but it's just so sad that when I have these conversations, even the one like we're having now, and yours was positive, but each one of us as like racialized bodies going into a health practitioner's place cannot be certain that we're going to get the best of care, and that's just so disappointing.
And it's frustrating. It's frustrating because when you go to the doctor and you're sitting there and you're waiting and you're waiting and you're waiting, and then they come in and 3 minutes, they ask questions, 3 minutes, done, and they're out. And I'm thinking, but I don't feel well. I know myself, I know my body, there's something wrong. And the amount of times I've had to go back over and over again for them to say, oh, well, it's this.
And that's at a GP. That's not like you're going into a walk-in clinic. That's not like, that's where
Yeah.
they're supposed to know you, they're supposed to care for you, they're supposed to check things out. Like that's your first point of contact for a lot of people, And we are in Canada, a place that people talk about our healthcare. Like
Absolutely.
it's part of our reputation.
Our reputation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, I need to be seen. Like, stop looking for and again, I check my bias every single time. I'm the same as you. I go in armed with information, and that's very much society today. Everyone is armed with a walking computer. We're armed. We're much more articulate. We do our research. We know 4 degrees of separation, what our diagnosis is. My doctors hate it, but we have to. And it's again 1 out of 5 experiences in itself that you had a great experience, and that's what I'm going for. And like for mine, when I think about mine, like, what if I didn't have a Black doctor? And I'm not putting it just on that, but what if I didn't have someone that saw me and heard me and like really lean into it, as opposed to your thing, 3 seconds, 3 minutes, and I'm in, and they're already like looking at their clock for the next piece. Like, what if? Like, how many people are out there in our community that aren't having that same level of care, and they're taking that first diagnosis? And that's really what's perpetuating this.
And I'm thinking it's getting worse right now because of COVID, right?
COVID.
In terms
Yes.
of, because the other day I had a sniffle, and I'm like, and I'm on the computer,
alert,
and
high
you know, and because I'm a therapist,
Or
I'm
seeing your doctor
so many-
online, or
yeah,
listening, just talking to them on the
Yeah.
phone. I haven't seen my doctor in months.
exactly. And then I'm seeing a lot of clients now where they're anxious. Like, I think all of us are feeling this level of anxiety. There was this article that was written about how people are coping right now because of COVID. And even though you might not think that you're anxious, we're all experiencing a level of anxiety because we're just not knowing how to plan.
Right. And also because of pre-existing conditions, the Black community is definitely more adversely affected by COVID. And also being part of the essential services, being out there as, you know, PSWs and front-facing with people who may have it, easier to contract it. So definitely COVID does, you know, and I know this, you know, this is Canada and we have different healthcare, but certainly, you know, we hear the stories in the States of people who, Black communities who aren't going when they get diagnosed, or even to get diagnosed because they're so afraid of the kind of care that they will not receive. So it really is, you know, something and heightened, as you say, with COVID.
And I think you hear it buzzing around. I think everyone has heard through the media, COVID is impacting marginalized community. COVID is impacting the Black communities and Vismin communities. But like, are people sitting with the weight on the how? And you nailed it. You know, systemically, we are the frontline workers. We're the ones exposed. So to go and admittedly sit in, I am sick, and if I go and acknowledge this illness, I'm going to have to take time off work, which is going to impact my family. And when we think about and put on that spectrum, now does it make sense? Like now when you hear that buzzword, does it make sense on how this is impacting us and to that weight? And I think that's really like the true struggle when people try to kind of attach and connect systemic and challenges and then marginalized communities and like how does it all make sense, and is it just because, you know, they're traditionally considered poor? No, like put it all together. We've done so much of growth as far as from an income perspective in our communities, but we're still out there, whether it be frontline workers or whatever the case may be. Like we are out there, but we are ingrained to sit in that strength and sit in that support for our family that we can't sit in that illness.
And on
So
top
it's
of that,
crazy.
imagine like you're part of a community that's been systematically, like you're saying, let down by the healthcare system and let down by these providers, and all of a sudden the only space you're supposed to look at for truth and for guidance is that same place that's let you down.
Right.
So it's like I've had to even have conversations within my family where it's like, yes, you have to wear your mask, you know, like this is important. Yes, it's coming from such and such governmental body or whatever, and you may have your own personal opinions, like political leanings, whatever, but this is not political, you know? This is about your health, and it's about you being safe and you being here to leave a legacy and you being here to like just literally be there for your community and continue to make the changes that you're making, you know?
It's a paradigm of trust.
No.
It's a paradigm of trust for sure. And again, to your point, like the message is coming from this broken system, and now we're supposed to be listening to this system that keeps failing us in our 1 in 5 example. Like it's completely wild.
I know that when COVID first started, my grandma would still be like, "Oh, when are you coming over?" And I was like, "Grandma, no, I'm not coming over. Like, let's talk on the phone. You know, like, don't have any of your friends over. Like, this is serious stuff."
My dad lives with me. He's 91 years old, right? And he's got the pre-existing conditions. So we were very, very careful. And, you know, some people didn't understand that and others did. And so we had friends who would help with grocery shopping and put everything just on the porch. Even my sister couldn't come and visit, right? She'd stand outside, my dad would stand inside, they'd kind of wave at each other, and that was what they had to do because it is serious. It is something to be concerned about. And the pre-existing conditions are already, some of them are conditions that as a Black community we are predisposed to already. So they exist, you know, within us, right? So.
And can we talk for a second, guys, about navigating through COVID at the same time as the Black Lives Matter movement? I'm sure that we could talk about that even.
I was legit having this
a whole show,
conversation
but
around why did it take a movement and the world to pause for just acknowledgement? Like, absolutely.
I
think that's a
almost
great
think
segue.
because the world paused, that's why we were able to actually
Absolutely.
see what
Yes.
has happened.
If it, like, you know, we'll put it out there. If this pandemic didn't happen, would it have had the same effect, or would it have been, you know, another Sandra Bland? Like, it's really the weight of that. So it's like, do we thank you? Like, you know what I mean? Like, thank you, COVID? Like, I don't know. What are you guys thinking?
When we talk about it in the context of health, and we talk about it in the context of even mental health, right? It almost felt like a double whammy, right? Because first you're going through COVID, then you're going through a time in your life where you're getting all of these feelings that you thought that you had packed away, and all of these experiences that you've gone through are now coming up, and there's a spotlight on you that it's not that it's unwanted, but it's just you're not prepared for it.
Absolutely.
And now I feel like you fast forward a few months, we're in our second wave, and people are still talking about anti-racism. You're seeing way more Black people on TV, I don't know about you guys, than ever before in terms of representation, but there's something that feels like folks are getting desensitized. Like, oh, I'm hearing about this again, or you're watching a football game and, oh, they're wearing their Black Lives Matter shirts again. Like, do you think that in thinking about our health and in thinking about the Black Lives Matter movement that, we're going to be even more displaced as a community going forward?
I don't think so.
No?
Because I've seen, especially thinking about the Canadian experience of the Black Lives Matter movement, I think this was the first time where there was something huge and important and poignant happening in the States. And we were actually encouraged, or I felt encouraged, to just reach out to people in Canada and talk about our experiences, because so often it's, and I hate to use this word, overshadowed, because it's not about who has it worse, or it's not like a measuring system. It's just, I never felt invited to talk about my experience here. And even when I think about someone like my dad, he's never felt invited to talk about his experience. Just going through that and being isolated and managing like mental health, like we're saying, and talking to him more, he was able to share these very like scary experiences that he's had with police and just like with governing bodies over the years, because he is a Black man in Canada, So in some ways it was a huge double whammy, but I think it was also very important to like start a path for healing, at least in my family, where we can actually be open and share our struggles and share our challenges, but also share our triumphs and be together in that,
I grew up on both sides, so like growing up in the US for a portion of my life and having that direct comparison between what's happening in the US and the magnitude and it being acknowledged in Canada, like that's where I'm kind of going back to that whole, I'm not thanking COVID from a pandemic perspective, but thank you for the pause, because the conversation hasn't been had here to that degree. And to your point, like it hasn't felt welcome. Like we could very quickly acknowledge what's been happening in the US, right from, the televisation of like Rodney King, but like we didn't sit in it here.
Because it gets
here
dismissed.
It's different. Yes.
It gets dismissed. Oh, it's not as bad as
100%.
down there.
So to have leaders now verbally acknowledge, like we still have a long runway of change, but even within the organization that I work, like to have verbally acknowledge and ask me and want to have that forthright conversation. And you may not be comfortable with what I'm going to say, but to Renee's point, balancing mental health, COVID, and this change, like you're not ready. Because like we've been advocating for years. We've all been very active in the community, and that's really what brought us together. But then when the, to use your words, the script flipped, and then they're like, well, how do you feel about it? That was a lot too, from a mental health perspective. I felt so heavy having to constantly share how I'm feeling about what's happening in the conversations. I don't know if everyone, did you get a bunch of phone calls on like how are you feeling?
The message that I kept saying to people is, this is not new.
Yes.
And it's like, we experience this all of the time. It's just now it's new to you. Right.
But then you almost feel like ungrateful because your friends are coming
Yeah.
out and colleagues are, so it's like
100%.
it's such a spectrum of feelings.
And
to
it was
go-
it was good for me to hear from some of my friends who would say, "Oh my goodness, you've been talking about this for years. I didn't get
Yes.
it. You must be exhausted."
Yes.
Which that's right about the mental health, right? That's where we're at. We're exhausted because we've tried for so long to share this and sit back and think, you're not getting it. You're not getting it. So some people are getting it.
Now, mental health in our community, unfortunately, is like ostrich head in the sand. Like we don't want to discuss it. I know my grandmother's generation, it was like, you don't go to a psychologist or a social worker because then you're deemed crazy.
You're nodding. What are you thinking?
I just feel like it's so subjective. when you
Yeah.
think about mental health, right? And I think about a quote that, you know, I've used a bunch of times and I've heard used before, you know, well, there's children starving in Africa. And really what that means is, you know, what they're trying to get across in saying it is someone has it worse than you, which is sometimes a great place to kind of sit in, to be more grateful, I guess, for what you have. But I feel like we also have to think about the fact that there are some folks that can have feelings or thoughts that they can navigate through and go on with their lives that are absolutely debilitating for others. And I feel like we rank each other on, oh, well, you know, she's just going through that, but, you know, I'm a mom and I went through that, and it's really not that big of a deal. Or I went through a divorce and it's, you know, that's really not that big of a deal. But does it really matter, like, have that judgment on if someone's actually suffering mentally or not? Or do we just need to be like, that person's hurting and let me just be there for them in that way?
Accept it for what it is, yeah.
The stats do show us that there are more people from the Black community who are not necessarily, I guess the way the stats work is that we're not seeking the help, right? And we're not seeking the help. Part of the reason why, because we're stigmatized within our own community. But I think the other part of it as well is that the practitioners aren't likely to be people from the Black community. And they're also not likely to be educated as far as our cultures and our expectations.
That's what I was going to ask you
right?
about, yeah.
So it's a challenge, because even if you want to go and see someone and acknowledge that there is a challenge, then who do you see? Someone who has no idea, who sort of looks at you and says, oh, it must be bipolar. Because, well, what else could it be?
On top of that, we have this stereotype that we have to be strong.
Right.
And so if you go to the doctor and say, listen, I'm having problems just coping and managing, then you're weak. It's like you're either strong or you're weak. There's like nowhere in between.
Just like for myself being first generation, there's a lot of times where I've experienced depression, I've just experienced anxiety, but then there's like this inherent guilt that comes with me feeling this, knowing all the privileges I have. And that, coupled with all the challenges that I know both of my parents had gone through just coming to this country, not being born here, and how my dad was still able to succeed, and how my mom, while she was still with us, was still able to succeed. And
100%.
it's
Like, who are we to complain?
Yeah.
Like, you know, 100%, because that's part of that strong woman, Black woman complex, in that we, you know, we've been given this opportunity, generations of broken backs and missed opportunities that we've been given, and who are we to complain? Who are we to not sit in gratitude? So, like, you know, like, I think about even my tattoo, like, rise above. It's a constant reminder for me to be like above and beyond, to think about what, you know, the Tuskegee Airmen did, thinking about all these firsts of generations before me, and my responsibility to carry that forward and that legacy.
Probably about 5 or 6 years ago, when I was going through a divorce, and my ex-husband had moved out of the province, had 3 young children, and my career wasn't what I wanted. Like, I wanted to be an entrepreneur, so I was trying to go in that direction, and nothing seemed to be working. And I just felt bad. And when I would talk to my friends or my family, they said, "Oh, you're just going through a tough time. You're just feeling sad."
You're being
And I'm
dramatic.
like,
That's mine.
yes.
So
And
dramatic.
so I remember I was driving one day, and I thought, you know, if I just turn the wheel a little bit, I could end all of this. I could just end this pain. And it's not that I wanted to die. I wanted to end the pain that I was feeling. But I didn't feel, because I'm this strong Black woman, that I wasn't allowed to feel like I needed that help.
The weight of the responsibilities.
Yes, I had so many responsibilities. And so I ended up, I called up my best friend and my sister, and I said, guys, there's something wrong. Like, I wanted to die. And they said, okay, Jen, just call a psychologist, call a social. And I did, and I was diagnosed with depression. And they said, it's a situational depression. You're going through a really tough time. We're gonna, you know, work together, and we're gonna get through this, right? But had I not had the support of my best friend and my sister at that time, I really don't know what would have happened because of all that weight that I was feeling at that time.
And how long did it take for you to share that with others, that you're going through that depression? Because I feel like that stigma, even, as Ali talked to earlier.
Yeah. So the way that I got out of it was to share it. So I started to share, and I wrote a book, and my life drastically changed. Yeah, I wrote a book, girl.
I need it.
But yeah, so my life just drastically changed, and it was through sharing that I was able to get through it. And so I realized during that time that in order for me to be able to support other people, I have to create an environment for them to be able to share. And that's why I'm a therapist.
Yes, yeah. And I had something similar, but my depression, as it was then diagnosed, didn't happen until after my life was calm. Like after all the divorce and the single parenting and the remarrying and the whole thing, then all of a sudden I just was crying, and I couldn't figure it out. And finally went to my doctor because I was thinking of a way to get, sort of just be different. And yeah, and it was again situational. She told me to take a few weeks off work, and I did, and I worked with her and a counselor and worked through it. But yes, and I remember my mom, because I was afraid to tell her, didn't tell her I was off work, because I thought, oh no, she's just gonna lecture me, my
Yes.
wonderful Caribbean parents. And they dropped by the house one day unexpectedly.
Oh, no.
Like, oh, what are you doing home? Well, and so then I had to tell them, and my mom, God bless her, just looked at me and she said, it's okay. You're at that age
That's
where, as
amazing.
a woman, you've just taken on so much, and it's understandable, and it's good that you're taking a break, because most of us don't.
Once we open up and we just trust someone with our truth and sit in it and not be afraid to, if the narrative or people say you're dramatic, I can sit with that narrative and I can sit in that truth. And when you trust someone, the release of not having to be that strong Black woman and to be accepted by your mom, to be accepted by your best friend, and just share it, it changes the course. But it's a huge
That being
weight.
that vulnerable and sitting in that vulnerability.
100%.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to note as well that your experiences, even though situational, they even sound different than they are for some people. Like, there are some people that have a situational depression and they're not crying, or they're not, turning the wheel that one way. They're laughing, or maybe they're drinking, or maybe they're taking on way too much.
You'd never know.
You never really know. So it's all so subjective when it comes down to mental health, when you really think about it.
And so we need to open up that conversation, and that's why we're here.
Gotta have that sister
That's
circle.
why we're here. That's right. So you've heard our view. Now share yours. We want to hear yours. Please go to follow us on Instagram and share in the conversation. Ask your questions, and we'll see you next time.